Well, good afternoon, everyone. Sometimes when we talk to people who find it difficult to believe in God, the reason comes from the undeniable fact that there is human suffering in every corner of this planet, in every moment of every day. The idea is that if there is a God, then how could he allow such suffering? And some feel that if there is a God that allows this kind of suffering, well, then it's hard for them to justify worshiping a God that seemingly doesn't care about his creation. As we dig deeper into the subject today, we will see that this opinion comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between God and his creation. If we assume that it is God's purpose solely to cater to the needs and the desires of his creation, essentially mankind and their problems, if God's sole purpose is to serve man, if that's our opinion, then we will find it very difficult indeed to understand many things about God and the reasons why he does what he does. But if, on the other hand, we seek out the truth about the Creator's purpose with his creation, then we will find that indeed it is incredibly unfair to blame God for the suffering that we see all around us. And also, when we look into the true purpose of God, we will find that he has both the intent and the plan to end suffering. And not just the little bit of suffering that I might feel from time to time, but to end all suffering, everywhere, with everyone, forever. Now, when we think about it, there's a lot of suffering on a personal level. Car accidents kill and injure thousands of people every day. Innocent people are robbed, assaulted, kidnapped, murdered. There are accidents that happen in the home or at work or at school. Babies are stillborn. Elderly fathers and mothers succumb to old age and the problems that are associated with advanced years. Soldiers from our hometown don't come home from foreign lands. Men and women lose their jobs, which causes whole families to spiral down into poverty. Children lose parents, parents lose children. All of these things cause pain and sorrow, and we have to admit that at some point each one of us is going to be affected. If we step back a little bit, we will see that suffering occurs on a global scale as well. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about our personal sufferings or if we're talking about global suffering. The root of the problem is the same. So while there are many things which affect us personally, this afternoon we will need to limit our consideration to the big problems that face society, the big sufferings that face society, the kinds of things that many people today feel that God should just fix. So there's several categories of this. First, the pain and misery that is caused by illness. There's a twist on illnesses and diseases these days, because it appears that there is a rise of disease in the world, that more people are affected, but even more interestingly, our world is experiencing a reemerging of diseases, old diseases, things that mankind thought they had a handle on, that these things were taken care of and would not return. The global problem with disease is substantiated by research in the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization has identified a number of diseases whose worldwide reemergence should be monitored. We may have heard of some of these: diphtheria, cholera, dengue fever, yellow fever, and as unbelievable as it might sound, even the bubonic plague. Of course, we know the bubonic plague more commonly as the Black Plague, which killed an estimated 25 million Europeans in the 14th century. Earlier this year, public broadcast reported that the resurgence of diseases once thought to be eradicated is a growing problem in both the developed and developing world. Again, a list of diseases that we may have heard of: scarlet fever, whooping cough, tuberculosis have all had recent outbreaks. And a polio-like disease is causing partial paralysis in children in California and in Australia. And along with this, we might note that polio itself continues to circulate in certain areas of the world, places like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Nigeria. And of course, something we are currently familiar with, the recent deadly outbreak of Ebola in Western Africa. This has captured the attention of the whole world, and especially the American media. And fear of this disease has spread like wildfire. But Ebola is not a new problem. The family of viruses that Ebola belongs to was discovered in the 1960s. There was a disease called the Marburg virus, and it affected 435 people in Rhodesia, South Africa, Kenya, Congo, Angola, and Uganda. Out of those 435 people who contracted the disease, 370 perished. That's an incredible 85%. This is the same family of diseases that Ebola belongs to. In the mid-1970s, Ebola itself emerged in Zaire and the Sudan. The first outbreak of Ebola claimed 53% of those who contracted the disease. Now, the recent outbreak in Africa has experienced, it has been reported that there's approximately 21,000 people have been affected by this disease in Western Africa. And it has claimed the lives of over 8,000. Over 8,500 people have perished because of Ebola. And the World Health Organization believes that, now it's reported 21,000 people have contracted Ebola in Western Africa, but the World Health Organization believes that that number could easily be 3 times that. Some 60,000 people. Now, what's equally disturbing about these numbers and about the reemerging of these old diseases is that it is occurring in some of the poorest and least prepared countries in the world. These countries don't have the technology or the medicines that is needed to combat these kinds of diseases. The effect of that, of course, is that it becomes widespread, that it becomes a threat to the whole population. Now, much aid has been given to those nations in Western Africa, and it's kind of passed out of the news, hasn't it? We don't hear so much about Ebola anymore. It's still there, but we just don't hear about it as much as we used to. And help has been given by many nations, but one could wonder, could more have been done, and could more have been done sooner? And how much of the world's response to Ebola has been made because of their fear of the disease, fear that it'll spread here? how much of the world's response has been made to protect themselves. Now, this Ebola virus was discovered again in the 1970s. So that's, 50 years ago in West Africa. And there have been outbreaks of Ebola since these years, 1976, 77, 79, 89, 90, 92, 94, 96, 97, 97, 2000, 2001, 03, 04, 07, 08, 09, 2011, 2012. These are previous outbreaks of the Ebola disease in Africa. We didn't hear about that, did we, until the last year. And why is that? Primarily because this country was threatened, in a sense. Now, in all of those years that I just outlined, 1,548 people perished from Ebola. That doesn't sound like so much. And it really, the key to understanding the effect of these kinds of diseases is not necessarily how many people contract it, although that is a problem, 21,000 to 60,000 last year. But what is the percentage of fatalities? It is very, very high compared to other diseases that pass amongst the population of the world. Ebola is a very deadly disease, as is obviously the bubonic plague. And scarlet fever and yellow fever, these are dangerous diseases. And they seem to be cropping up more and more, again, in countries that are less prepared to deal with the consequences. They don't have the funds. They don't have the doctors and the medicine to stop it before it becomes an epidemic. Those countries who are poor and unprotected from these diseases. Another category of pain and suffering is what is associated with crime and violence in our world. Now, I have recently read articles that optimistically report these statistics that show that crime and violence is on the decline, but I really kind of wonder about that. Because I have noticed, and probably you have too on the news, that coinciding with the downturn of the economy in recent years, there has been a sharp spike in reports of bank robberies, armed robberies in convenience stores, even people stealing donation jars off of the countertops in convenience stores, people breaking into unoccupied houses in order to steal aluminum and copper. Fraud, familiar with that. Identity theft, that is something that is seemingly rampant today. Financial information that is stolen through a variety of retail outlets. Well, the effect of this crime and violence in our world today, it ranges from a slight inconvenience. We might be slightly inconvenienced by needing to get another credit card because our old one is closed down because of fraud. But it jumps way up from there to personal harm and even death when we're talking about armed robberies, when we're talking about convenience stores and gas stations being held up at knife point and gunpoint. So the FBI says that violent crime has been on the decrease since 2008, but that's not very much comfort to someone who loses a loved one through a drive-by shooting or a botched robbery or even a mass shooting. And speaking of mass shootings, and when we think about mass shootings, our minds typically go to the schools in our country. Well, since the Columbine High School shooting in 1999, there have been 62 incidents of major school shootings. Now, a major school shooting is defined where one student or teacher or school employee is killed or injured. That's a major school incident. So there's been 62 of these in 15 years. It's something that is familiar to us because it seems to be in the news so much. And one of the scary things about these mass shootings is quite often the motive goes undiscovered. Nobody really knows why. They attribute it to some form of mental problem on the shooter, but when the shooter shoots himself, the motive goes unknown. And the rise of these types of things puts our society in grave danger. Pain and suffering associated with crime and violence. And there's an element in our society today that is fed by popular media. Violence, this aspect or element of violence and crime is fed by the media. And I don't mean to say that movies and video games are solely to blame for the violence in our times, but rather that we might consider how violence and crime can be experienced as a form of entertainment. Just one single significant example. There's a game, and I just saw an ad for it recently, the next of the series called Grand Theft Auto. And this is how this game, Grand Theft Auto, is described in one of the gamer magazines. They said, each game in this series allows players to take on the role of a criminal or a wannabe criminal in the big city, typically an individual who plans to rise through the ranks of organized crime through the course of the game. The player is given various missions by kingpins and major idols in the city underworld, which must be completed to progress through the storyline. Assassinations and other violent crimes are featured regularly. NBC did a report on why this particular game has become so popular. NBC reported, on paper, Grand Theft Auto games are shorthand for everything that is wrong with America. Violence, prostitution, drug smuggling, gun running, political corruption, racial tensions, and oh yeah, Grand Theft Auto. But despite the criminal themes, the Grand Theft Auto games are some of the best-selling and best-reviewed in the business. What is it about Grand Theft Auto games that appeal to gamers? One player is quoted as saying, "I get to indulge my dark side for a bit." So these kinds of games encourage players to immerse themselves in a fantasy world for hours, that they might nurture the baser and more violent, hardly valiant, the baser and more violent aspect of their nature. What is the effect of this? It's a desensitizing to actual crime and violence in our society. Now, if we're talking about violence, we would have to add the suffering of war. And probably the most familiar in our day would be the conflict in the Middle East, and more specifically, ISIS. But as with Ebola, ISIS is just the most recent example. If we were to look back in history, look back just 150 years to the Civil War, the time of the Civil War, we would find that there have been 340 notable wars in that 150 years. Not in the United States, of course, but around the world. Since the time of the Civil War, there have been 340 notable wars with a reserve death toll of 188 million people. That's a lot of violence. And men's wars typically are disagreements over philosophy, whether that philosophy is political or religious. Sometimes men will fight about territory, and they often fight over money, but they call it national interest. And of course, any combination of these things. There's an element in human society of violence that is justified through war, or seemingly justified through war. But nevertheless, there is a great amount of suffering that is caused in this world on a personal level by violence and on a global level as well by violence. And unfortunately in our society, this kind of thing is glorified. As there was the Grand Theft Auto game, there are games which glorify war. And so the young minds of our society are being fed and nurtured in violence. And therefore they are being desensitized to the problem. So now I want to add just one more element of suffering, something that contributes hugely to this in our modern times, and that would be natural disasters. So we have tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and that should look familiar to us. Earthquakes and floods. In 2013, there were 352 registered natural disasters in the world, according to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Data. So there's an office in the UN that monitors these kinds of things, that gathers data. And according to their data, there have been 352 in 1 year alone, major natural disasters. And these accounted for nearly 23,000 deaths. And some 96 million people were personally affected. Obviously, they lost their homes, they lost their business, or they lost loved ones affected by these kinds of things. The U.S. Geological Survey reports that the occurrence of earthquakes that register between 6.0 and 8.0 on the Richter scale, so these are major earthquakes. The number of earthquakes that are between 6.0 and 8.0 have risen from just under 5 back in the mid-90s. So there were 5 a year back in the mid-90s, and has risen to 40 a year in that amount of time. So from just under 5 a year to 40 a year, these major earthquakes around the world. And hurricane trends are very, very similar. It's been determined that over the last 30 years, the number of hurricanes that rise to a category 4 or 5, so again, it's a major hurricane, a major catastrophe. The number of those hurricanes in the last 30 years has grown by 80%. That's nearly double. So the effect of climate change is something that is hotly debated amongst scientists. And understandably, we might be a little dubious about how something that we do in our puny lives could affect the whole world, the whole earth. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is that you and I are not alone. We have some 7 billion neighbors on this planet. And consider the effect that a population that large will have on air pollution and water pollution, depleting natural resources. These things do have an effect on our planet. We might like to say, no, that couldn't be. Something I do in my life? Well, it's not something that I do, but it's something that we all do that is having an effect on the planet. Now, it's been recently reported that fracking, you may be familiar with that term, fracking, it is a hotly contested method of breaking up rock underground using water pressure in order to release petroleum and natural gas. So in other words, the way that we've been enjoying the effects of this by our gas prices actually dipping down to under $2, and natural gas is very, very cheap. So indeed, this method of breaking up the rock underground is beneficial to us in our modern society, but they have found that fracking is affecting dormant fault lines that were previously unknown. And of course, it's not affecting them for the good. It's adversely affecting these fault lines. And we've had a few earthquakes recently in New Hampshire. I don't know that we could directly attribute that to fracking. I don't think that goes on around here. But just the fact that these fault lines very often are connected all around the world. And man is having an effect. You add these things all together, air pollution, water pollution, and whatever methods man chooses to try to make his life better is adversely affecting this planet and affecting its systems of weather and structure. So all of these things contribute to human suffering on a global scale. Now, there is more that we could say about financial hardship, about birth defects, homelessness, broken families, a lot of other things. But all of these together only show how bad things are in our world today. We can blissfully ignore them, perhaps, until it happens to us. But that is part of the problem. If we ignore it until it happens to us, that allows these things to grow in the world. So, yes, there are a lot of problems. There is a lot of suffering. And so the question comes, why does God not stop the suffering in this world? Why doesn't he just step in and take away all the things that cause people to despair, that cause people to suffer? I personally have been asked that question. My answer always begins with a single phrase. There is something very fundamental in the way that God has designed this world, and it has so much to do with why things are the way they are in the world in which we live today. And that single phrase is free will. Now, the Webster's Dictionary describes or defines free will as the ability to choose how to act, to make choices that are not controlled by fate or God. So essentially what this means is when we are faced with a decision, we are free to choose our own course. Man was not created as a machine programmed with predetermined responses for everything that he is going to encounter. God created man with the ability to choose what he wants to do. In fact, if we look at one of the first times that free will was exercised, we can gain valuable insight into the whole problem about suffering and trouble and hardships. So here is the record from Genesis then. Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, has God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God does know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So we need to look past the fact that Eve was conversing with a snake, because the reality of that situation is not what we're talking about this afternoon. So instead, let's focus on the choice that was set before Adam and Eve. The choice where they could exercise their free will. Now, what Eve says about the fruit of the trees comes directly from Genesis chapter 2, because this is what they had been told by God. They were allowed to eat from all the trees except one. That tree was forbidden to them. And God warned them that there would be consequences if they ate of that tree. The serpent told Eve something very much different about that tree. And now she had to make a choice. She had to decide what she was going to do. God did not program Adam and Eve with automatic obedience. She could choose on her own. And she chose to disobey God's commandment. She decided to listen to the serpent and eat that fruit. She exercised her free will to choose. And Adam after her did as well. He also exercised his free will and chose also to disobey. So what follows after in the record for Adam and Eve in verses 16 through 19 of Genesis chapter 3, these are the consequences for their choice. So they have the free will to choose, but God had warned them that there would be consequence for disobedience. And these verses outline the consequences. Now look at the phrases that are highlighted there. The key words, sorrow. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. That word means grief. And thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. And that means pain. I will multiply thy grief. And in pain you will bring forth children. Cursed is the ground. Again, sorrow. In sorrow thou shalt eat of the fruit of the ground all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles. So instead of fruit, the ground would bring forth thorns and thistles, which we know there's very little you can do with thorns and thistles except burn them. They are weeds. It's not something you can eat. It's not something you can use to build. It's useless. It's a curse in itself. Sweat. In the sweat of thy face. So there will be difficulty. There will be labor involved in staying alive. And unto dust shalt thou return. And of course that last phrase there, that is what God had warned them in chapter 2. Because he said, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Unto dust thou shalt return. Sorrow, pain, grief, curse, and ultimately death. These are the consequences for the choice that they had made. And so this is a point that I would like to make. God gave man free will that he might make his own choices, but there are always consequences that are associated with the choices that we make. Adam and Eve chose not to obey God, and so dire consequences came as a result of that choice. And these things that we see here in these verses, this is the root of suffering. Suffering involves grief, pain, hardship, difficulty, conflict, adversity, and ultimately death. These all came about because of a choice, a conscious decision to not obey God's commandment when he had so clearly warned them about the consequences. But he gave them free will to make their own choice. So what about all the troubles that we looked at earlier? Disease and epidemics. Well, thousands of people suffer when others choose to not concern themselves with what is going on all around them. As people, we become so focused on our own affairs that we become indifferent to things that are happening in other places, to other people, until it gets to such a point that it's either endangering us or we just simply cannot ignore it. Unhealthy circumstances become epidemic when these things are ignored. When our attention is, I really couldn't care what's going on elsewhere. I'm more involved in my own problems, my own life, what I need to do. What happens in Western Africa, it's not going to affect me. That's a very callous way of looking at it. Because lives are being affected, and people are suffering and dying because of indifference. Until, again, it becomes such a problem, oh, I guess we're going to have to respond. I guess we're going to have to send doctors. I guess we're going to have to send money, because if we don't, it's going to come here and it's going to affect me. We make a conscious decision to ignore things that are going on in the world because we're so caught up in our own lives. Crime and violence. People suffer when other people choose a life of crime and violence. When other people choose to victimize as many people as they can. A life of working for pay is abandoned so that someone can get what they want by taking it away from other people. Lives are destroyed because selling drugs is a quick and easy way to make money. Crime is a choice that causes so much suffering. War is very much the same, because men choose to fight to preserve their philosophy, the ideology that they hold, when someone else's philosophy threatens them. That's the underlying basis for wars. The countries choose to go to war to protect either their philosophy, which in this country would be democracy, or their national interests. It's a choice. It doesn't happen by accident. And finally, natural disasters. So, as inhabitants of this earth, can we really expect that there would be no consequences for modern life? That polluting the atmosphere and polluting the water and polluting the land, that these things wouldn't cause problems? That heedless exploitation of natural resources, which often involves dangerous and destructive methods like fracking and offshore drilling, do we really think that this won't have an effect on the planet? Or do we choose not to think about it as long as gas is under $2? Well, that's the question, isn't it? But these things do have an adverse effect on the systems of our planet. Man chooses to live life oblivious to the harm that is being caused in order to maintain the standard of living that we are accustomed to. And no one is completely innocent in this. So is it fair then to blame God for the problems that we face in these days, in these modern times? Or is our situation, which seems to get worse with every passing day, the accumulating effect of the choices that mankind has made for thousands of years? And remember, again, we're not alone. There are over 7 billion people on this earth, and everyone is choosing to live the way that they want. They're living life the way they see fit without caring about consequences of the decisions that are made. It seems rather cynical, but it is true. So does that mean every time someone suffers that he or she has made some decision that earns them that suffering, that difficulty? No. But we don't exist in a bubble. The things that we do will often affect other people's lives, even sometimes to their harm. For example, the man who chooses to rob the convenience store, which is the exercising of his free will, well, this causes hardship for others, maybe even physical harm or death. It's a consequence of the decision that he has made. It will affect his life, but it will also affect the lives of others because, again, we do not live in a bubble. And this choice that this person makes to do what he wants without regard for others, well, this is an expression of the bigger problem where mankind in general does what they want to do with little or no regard for the consequences upon themselves and upon others. Now this atmosphere, if you will, is a lack of morality. Lack of morality is what causes this kind of situation, because morality is what allows us to choose to choose the right instead of the wrong. So we can make a choice, but what guides us to make the right choices? Morality. Where we can exercise our free will, the free will that God has given us, to do things that are beneficial to others, things that are thoughtful, things that are positive, instead of being negligent and harmful in our decisions. When morality disappears, bad choices increase. And the consequence is that evil is compounded. And so there is more suffering. And we live in an age where we are bombarded with suffering. You cannot watch the news. You cannot read a newspaper. You cannot open a magazine, if it's a news magazine, without reading about the problems that are going on around the world. The question is, how does that affect you? Or does that affect you? Or is it simply words on a page that really have no bearing upon my life? I'm going to do what I want to do, regardless of what's happening elsewhere in the world. So the answer to the question that is posed by the title of this talk, why does God allow suffering, is that God allows suffering because he has given mankind free will, and because he has established a law of consequence. There are cause and effect all around us that we are very, very familiar with. Fire burns. And if we are careless with fire, it can cause great harm and suffering. Cold can freeze. We're familiar with that at this time of year, aren't we? If we're negligent when we are exposed to cold weather, we will suffer the consequences for that. In water, we can drown. And so we're careful around water, understanding that there can be a dire consequence if we ignore the properties of water. Fire burns. Cold can freeze. Water will drown. We need to be careful. We cannot be negligent. Because if we are, then there are consequences that we will likely suffer. And this is the law of consequence that was established by God. And it was given to give man a sense of responsibility, that we might understand that what we choose to do is going to have an effect upon ourselves and upon others. And if we choose things that are harmful, the consequence of that is harm. And the result of that is suffering. So now we need to ask a different question. Does God have a plan to end suffering? What is God's solution for all the suffering that we've been talking about. Does God have a plan? Well, thankfully, the Bible tells us that he does. And as I said earlier, God's solution to the problem will solve the whole problem of suffering, not just what affects me. It will affect all suffering, everywhere, for everyone, for all time. So in order to understand what the Creator intends to do about the troubles in this world, the pain that we experience, the sorrow that is a common element in life, well, we need to accept a single fact, and it's a simple fact, but it's found throughout the Word of God. All throughout the Bible, we learn that God, the God of heaven, has a plan to establish on earth a kingdom where his law will be enforced, and he will educate people about making good choices, and he will educate people about the consequences for not making good choices. And this is something, again, that we find from Genesis to Revelation. So let's bring up just a couple of references from the Bible to show you what I'm talking about. And I think most of us are familiar with the Lord's Prayer that we read in Matthew 6. Notice the bold words there. Thy kingdom come. Jesus is teaching the disciples how to pray. And in that prayer, they are praying to the Father, to the God of heaven, and they say, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, this prayer is very well known. It's spoken over and over again every day. Well, certainly we've noticed those words before. But is this something that we have given any thought to? What does it mean? When Jesus is teaching them to pray for God's kingdom to come, for his will to be done on this earth, what does that mean? Well, in Daniel chapter 2, the Jewish prophet Daniel, who was a captive in the city of Babylon, he interprets a dream for Nebuchadnezzar the king. In his dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees a great image, and Daniel describes it to him. He says that the image had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet that were part iron and part clay. And then Daniel goes on and identifies the metallic parts as being empires, or representative of empires that would begin with Babylon as that head of gold. Then history tells us that the Babylonian kingdom was followed by the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, represented by the chest and arms of silver. After that would come the kingdom of the Greeks, represented by the brazen belly and thighs of the image. Rome came next as the two legs of iron. And then there would come a time when there is no one world power, but a mixture of nations, some that are strong and some that are weak. And at this point in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, a stone appears, and it hits the image in the feet. And it grinds that whole image to powder. And then that stone becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. And in verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2, the prophet identifies what that stone is. Daniel says, and in the days of these kings, that would be of the feet, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, Babylonian down through Roman, down through modern, and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So God is revealing through the prophet Daniel that he intends to establish a kingdom on this earth, that it will take away the kingdoms of men, that it will become a kingdom that will fill the whole earth. And this is what Jesus taught his disciples to pray for. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There's many, many other places that we could turn to. But this gives you an idea of what we're talking about. And there are verses that we're going to look at that will describe what that kingdom will be like. And these will show us how that God will solve the problem of suffering. And this is what we want to focus on. Because God does care. He takes no pleasure in human suffering, but he will not ignore his laws and his principles, which he set in place when he created this world. God's way of removing suffering is by improving the conditions in which mankind lives. And this isn't done with a snap of his fingers, but through the process of the establishing of his kingdom and the things which follow after. He will begin by educating mankind about the wisdom of God's ways. And he will guide men and women to make better choices. He will help men and women to consider the welfare of others, to see the long term instead of living in the moment, to understand that while there are consequences for bad decisions, there are good consequences for making the right choices and for doing the right thing. And these blessings will be many in the way that God will take away suffering. Let's start with that education. Man will be instructed in the ways of God. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3, many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways. We will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So people will be eager to learn. People will seek out the ways of God. We have it now in our Bibles. And it's a great effort to read and to learn and to apply. And that's what's expected of us now. But in the kingdom age, it will be much more visible. When the king sits upon his throne, the law will go forth, and the word of the Lord will go forth, that men and women might be educated. And again, there will be an eagerness to understand, because men and women will see the blessings all around them from that kingdom, the things that God is going to offer. In Zechariah 8, verses 20 to 22, we read, thus saith the Lord of hosts, it shall come to pass that there shall come people, the inhabitants of many cities, the inhabitant of one city shall go to another, saying, let us go speedily to pray before the Lord, and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will go also. Yea, many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray before the Lord. Well, that has not happened in our lifetime. That has not happened in our history. This is something that is future. God will establish a kingdom, and he will bring about great blessings, and people will respond by seeking out the way of the Lord. Because what is it that good choices are based upon? It's based on morality. Morality is the exercising of the free will based upon an understanding of the good things of God. It begins with education. And so God will educate the world. Now God promises to end wars and violence. Isaiah 2 verse 4, and he shall judge, or that word judge means govern, among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now think about that. The instruments of war will be turned into instruments of farming and harvesting. So the tools of destruction will be turned into a more productive use. They will have a different purpose in the hands of men, rather than killing and destroying and ruining. They will be for building up and planting and harvesting. Psalm 46 verse 9, he makes wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, cuts the spear in sunder. He burns the chariot in fire. Now the word translated end there means the extremity, the outside border. So it's talking about the whole earth. God will cause wars to cease in the whole earth. He will utterly destroy the weapons of destruction. No longer will men impose their will upon others through violence. God will bring peace to the earth. And he will teach what equity is, what fairness is to men and women. In Isaiah 11, the prophet describes the king who will rule in God's kingdom, that being the Lord Jesus Christ. The prophet says, "He shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked." So this king who will sit upon the throne in God's kingdom, that being his son, this king will rule righteously and fairly. No longer will the little guy be oppressed by the powerful of this world. No longer will the wicked take advantage of the innocent, because God is going to establish true justice in this earth. Hunger will no longer be a problem in this world. We see poverty on almost every street corner in our world, where children go to bed hungry, not knowing when or where they will eat. Moms and dads being unable to care for their children and their physical needs, hunger and thirst. Well, God is going to solve the problem. Psalm 72, we see a vision of God's coming kingdom. In Psalm 72, verse 2, we read words that are very similar to what we already read in Isaiah 11 about the king's righteous reign. Psalm 72, verse 2 says, "He shall judge thy people with righteousness, and thy poor with judgment." So this is talking about the same king sitting upon the throne in God's kingdom. This is the kingdom that God will establish. This is the equity and the fairness. Well, later on in that Psalm 72 and verse 16, we read, "There shall be an handful of corn in the earth upon the tops of the mountains. The fruit thereof shall shake like Lebanon. And they of the city shall flourish like grass of the earth." Now, corn in the Bible is grain. And so what this describes for us is an incredible bounty. Amos chapter 9, verses 13 to 14, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that sows seed. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and the hills shall melt. I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them." So the earth is going to bring forth in plenty, because God is going to reverse the curse of Genesis 3. Remember what that says. "Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee." Well, in the pictures of the kingdom, we see an abundance of grain. We see great prosperity and the easing of the problem of hunger. The earth will be able to bring forth an abundance. It will bear fruit greater than what we can gather out of it now, because we are living under the curse. And what this tells us is the reaper will barely have time to bring the harvest in before the plowman begins his work anew. A great bounty. The nature of illness will be changed, and miraculous healing will take place. Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a harp, and the tongue of the dumb sing." And life itself will be extended in God's kingdom. Isaiah 65, verse 20, "There shall be no more thence an infant of days, nor an old man that has not filled his days, for the child shall die 100 years old." So someone who dies at 100 is like a child, just a young child. So the disease, with the ills that accompany it, pain and sorrow, suffering, in God's kingdom, these things will be eased. And people will live longer and enjoy life so much more. My final verse comes from the last book of the Bible, Revelation 21, verse 4. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. So the idea of God wiping away tears is not literal, but it means that God is going to take away all the causes for weeping. And that means suffering will be no more. So the answer to the question, does God care about suffering? Well, yes, he does. Is he going to do something about it? The Bible clearly tells us that he will. The choice is before us at this point, whether or not we want to share in that kingdom, whether or not we want to be part of the wonderful things that God has promised, and these things will come to pass. And the Bible tells us that suffering and sorrow will pass away from memory. God has given us free will. And so may we have the wisdom to choose life and to choose the blessing that he has promised in his kingdom to come. So let us open up God's word then and learn more about how he intends to end suffering in this world and discover how that we can all have a share in the things which he has promised. God does care about his creation, and he has a plan by which he intends to end suffering everywhere, for everyone, for all time.